Now we want to see together how to generate new primitives with the composition tools. Let's create a new curved poly with Create New in the Game Objects tools, and then let's move on to the composition tools. From here we can go to the primitives menu, where we find the specific buttons for generating primitives. For example, we can generate a circle, which represents a filled circle, which by default is made up of 4 polygons. Parameters appear in the dedicated inspector that allow us to check the structure of the circle. For example, we can control the radius, or we can modify the number of segments in which the circle is divided. Finally, we can change the size with which each slice is divided. It is therefore possible to work on all these parameters to obtain different results. We can also move the pivot, which represents the insertion position of the primitive. If I press reset, the primitive is repositioned in the position indicated by the pivot, but all its parameters are reset to the default values, so it is useful to position the pivot before going to customize the primitive. Below we find the tessellation parameters, which are not directly visible here, because they represent the hints that will then be used, for example, in the tessellation tools. In this case the hints B and E are assigned, which will be used on the circles and radii of the primitive. For example, if we go to the tessellation tools and select all the polygons of the primitive, we can see how the hints are assigned to the various edges of the model. Returning to composition tools, what happens is that, having changed the tool, the original primitive is no longer customizable, because all the operations, such as inserting a new primitive, are automatically confirmed when the tool set is changed. But now we can create a new primitive. We position the pivot in the point where we want the primitive to be generated. If I click on cylinder, once again I can go and check the structure of the cylinder in the dedicated panel. For example, we can define the radius, the height, the size of the top and bottom part of the cylinder. If I reduce it to 0, what I get is a cylinder, otherwise what I get is more of a capsule. Here too we can control the parameters that define the number of circles and the number of segments into which the cylinder is divided. I can also choose whether to remove the top or the bottom. When a primitive matches my expectations, I can confirm the work with apply. At this point the primitive customization module is removed and I can start with a new primitive. Let's for example add a sphere. Also in this case with size and sides we are going to check the number of sides and polygons that are actually used to approximate the sphere. At any time if I don't like what I'm doing I can go to remove the primitive I'm working on with cancel. Let's put the sphere back. Now let's go to an overview of the primitives that have remained to be seen. For example, we have the quad sphere, which currently doesn't have parameters. Another primitive is the donut. Here I can control the size of the circles, and as for the other primitives the subdivision into polygons with which the donut is generated, as well as the tessellation parameters. An important feature here is that I can take off the bottom, the outside or the inside. I remind you that with the editing tools we will eventually be able to remove the parts that we do not need at a later time. Let's go and see other primitives. For example, let's create a quads, which represents a grid of quadrilaterals. I would like to show you here what happens if I go to greatly increase the number of quads that make up the quadrilateral. As you can see, some strange things can happen. This is partly due to the automatic unwrap functions, where the UV definition can be corrected by working in the materials tools, which offers many more options. However, it is often related to the way tessellation is done. In fact, as you can see by activating the wireframe, this quadrilateral grid is approximated with a very large number of triangles, and this can give some problems. In this case what may make sense is to reduce the hints used for the tessellation. And if I see that there are still problems related to unwrap, as mentioned I can go and make corrections at a later time in the materials tools. Speaking of materials management, as you know at this point it is very important in curved poly to correctly define the parts that make up a model. By default, when we create new primitives, they are generated as a set of separate parts, each with its default unwrap. In all cases, however, we may wish to correct these assignments later in the materials tools. Therefore, it may make sense to decide not to generate unwraps and not to further divide the model into several parts. In parts generation we go to uncheck separate and unwraps. For example, now I add the primitive bar. As with the other primitives, the bar has several parameters that allow me to control the size and number of polygons actually used to create the bar. The plate is similar to the bar, but has an extra dimension. Let's remove selection wire here. As usual, if you are generating models with many sides and many polygons, it is important to remember to change the tessellation parameters to reduce the number of triangles that are generated. And eventually I can remove the bottom side. The chamfer box is itself similar to the bar and plate, but can be divided into all three dimensions. In the chamfer box it is possible to remove the right, the top and the bottom, and as you can see, if I remove all three, I have only 3 sides left. Now please note that at this moment these 3 primitives have been generated without the little squares, in the sense that the unwraps have not been done. Also, if I go to press the S key to select all the polygons of the last part we generated, as you can see, the last primitives we generated are all selected in one shot, because the polygons were generated directly on the part that was active. Let's quickly see the latest primitives. We have cube, which as you can see has no parameters. Then we have the n-gon plate, which by default is a pentagonal base plate, but we can change the number of sides to 6, 7, or 8. It is interesting to know that I can have polygons with 5, 6, 7 or 8 sides in curved poly. Although the only other way to achieve this is to create parts from scratch with the editing tools or to import pre-made models that use this mechanism.